Lay down for yourself at the outset a certain stamp and type of character for yourself which you are to maintain whether you are by yourself or are meeting with people. And be silent for the most part, or else make only the most necessary remarks, and express these in few words. But rarely, and when occasion requires you to talk, talk indeed, but about no ordinary topics. Do not talk about gladiators, or horse races, or athletes, or things to eat or drink, topics that arise on all occasions. But above all, do not talk about people, either blaming or praising, or comparing them. If then you can, by your own conversation, bring over that of your companions to what is seemly. But if you happen to be left alone in the presence of aliens, keep silence. Do not laugh much, nor at many things, nor boisterously. Refuse if you can to take an oath at all, but if that is impossible, refuse as far as circumstances allow. Avoid entertainments given by outsiders and by persons ignorant of philosophy, but if an appropriate occasion arises for you to attend, be on the alert to avoid lapsing into the behavior of such laymen. For you may rest assured that if a man's companion be dirty, the person who keeps close company with him must of necessity get a share of his dirt, even though he himself happens to be clean. In things that pertain to the body, take only as much as your bare need requires. I mean such things as food, drink, clothing, shelter, and household slaves, but cut down everything which is for outward show or luxury. In your sex life, preserve purity as far as you can before marriage, and if you indulge, take only those privileges which are lawful. However, do not make yourself offensive or censorious to those who do not indulge, and do not make frequent mention of the fact that you do not yourself indulge. If someone brings you word that so-and-so is speaking ill of you, do not defend yourself against what has been said, but answer, "Yes, indeed, for he did not know the rest of the faults that attach to me. If he had, these would not have been the only ones he mentioned." It is not necessary for the most part to go to the public shows. If, however, a suitable occasion ever arises, show that your principal concern is for none other than yourself, which means, wish only for that to happen which does happen, and for him only to win who does win, for so you will suffer no hindrance. But refrain utterly from shouting or laughter at anyone or great excitement. And after you have left, do not talk a great deal about what took place, except insofar as it contributes to your own improvement. For such behavior indicates that the spectacle has aroused your admiration. Do not go rashly or readily to people's public readings, but when you do go, maintain your own dignity and gravity, and at the same time be careful not to make yourself disagreeable. When you are about to meet somebody, in particular when it is one of those men who are held in very high esteem, propose to yourself the question, what would Socrates or Zeno have done under these circumstances, and then you will not be at a loss to make proper use of the occasion. When you go to see one of those men who have great power, propose to yourself the thought that you will not find him at home, that you will be shut out, that the door will be slammed in your face, that he will pay no attention to you. And if, despite all this, it is your duty to go, go and take what comes, and never say to yourself, it was not worth all the trouble. For this is characteristic of the layman, that is, a man who is vexed at externals. In your conversation, avoid making mention at great length and excessively of your own deeds or dangers, because it is not as pleasant for others to hear about your adventures as it is for you to call to mind your own dangers. Avoid also raising a laugh, for this is a kind of behavior that slips easily into vulgarity, and at the same time is calculated to lessen the respect which your neighbors have of you. It is dangerous also to lapse into foul language. When therefore anything of this sort occurs, if the occasion be suitable, go even so far as to reprove the person who made such a lapse. If, however, the occasion does not arise, at all events show by keeping silence and blushing and frowning that you are displeased by what has been said. Chapter 33 of Epictetus' Enchiridion is an entire set of precepts with a few reasonings thrown in about how one ought to live the Stoic life, and they're mostly having to do with conduct, all sorts of different topics that are all bundled together in this chapter. So I'm just going to go through each of them in turn and comment on them a little bit. The key thing is that he says at the beginning that we should lay down for ourselves at the beginning a certain stamp and type of character for yourself, which you are to maintain whether you are by yourself or meeting with people. Now, he talks about, we could say, an arrangement, a taxon, it could be stamp, it could also be the way in which we arrange ourselves. And then tupon, that's also a stamp, but we get the word type from that. Decide for yourself what kind of person you're going to be. And then he says, maintain that. You're going to maintain this not only when you're engaging with other people, but here's the real test, whether you also do that when you're by yourself. Try to be one person, you might say, both in dealing with others and in dealing with yourself. So now he goes into the specific advice. The first thing that he says is be silent for the most part, or else make only the most necessary remarks and express these in a few words. Why is it so important to hold your peace, so to speak? Well, this is good advice in part because when we engage in a lot of idle chatter, we're easily getting entangled with other people's affairs. We're chitter-chattering about all sorts of things that don't usually concern us, and we can, easily cause other people pain, get them riled up, cause all sorts of issues to arise. So, make necessary remarks, express these in a few words. The Stoics were renowned for speaking in what was called the laconic fashion. It comes from Laconia, where the Spartans were. They tried to express things in as few words as possible. And why? So that they didn't make a big deal of themselves. And this is in a culture that really valued not only rhetoric, but sort of an overflowing, a copia in Latin or an abundance of words. So he says, rarely, and when occasion requires you to talk indeed, but about no ordinary topics. Don't get drawn in to the ordinary topics of the day, the things that everybody else is talking about. So, for example, what you're seeing in your Facebook stream, maybe don't talk so much about that. As a matter of fact, if we're considering our Facebook postings to be a kind of talking, maybe don't post so much, right? You don't need to put your thoughts out there for everybody else to scrutinize, to react to say, oh, what a brilliant person, or what a terrible person, any of those sorts of things. Now, he has examples that are a little bit harder for us to relate to in the present, but we can think about what would be contemporary examples like this. Don't talk about gladiators or horse races or athletes. Okay, so don't talk a lot about sports. Why not? Well, sports are, for many people, a way in which we can find some common ground and just engage at a very superficial level, right? And the goal for the Stoic is not to live a superficial life. Things to eat or drink, he says topics that arise on all occasions. So, in a culture that has become obsessed with what we now call food porn, perhaps talking about the latest restaurant, or talking about how you prepared these pears for this meal, or this wine sauce, maybe that's not quite so important. He gives a few other things. He says, but above all, do not talk about people. Don't engage in what we call gossip, or evaluation, or speculation, whatever you want to call it, right? We've got different names for it. It's really the same thing. How does he define it? He talks about praising and blaming. This is something that the ancients gave a lot of thought to. We don't need to praise people excessively, and we don't need to be always criticizing people. And then he says something really interesting. It's translated here as comparing them, but really the Greek term conveys the sense of engaging in judgment about them and connecting the judgment with somebody else. So, that's probably a good thing to keep in mind. The term is actually sun krinon. Krinein is to make a judgment about something, to be a judge, right? Sun krinein, to judge together, or to judge across the board. It's not just when we compare people to each other that we're making an objective comparison. We're really engaging in judgments about their value, about what matters, what doesn't matter, about who's up, who's down, and it can get very easy to get caught up in that sort of activity. So he says, if then you can by your own conversation bring over that of your companions to what is seemly. Try to, bring them around. But if you happen to be left alone in the presence of aliens, just keep silence. If you've got, a bunch of people, like say you're riding the bus, and people are chattering about all sorts of things, you don't have to make conversation. And you're not being rude by sitting down next to somebody in an airplane, for example, and after you say hello, reading your book. You're not hurting them. They may want to make chit-chat with you about all sorts of things, but there's no requirement that you do that. He goes on, and he talks about laughter. He says, do not laugh much, nor at many things, nor boisterously. And that's a very quick comment right there. A little bit later on, he's going to talk about laughing as well. He says, avoid raising a laugh, for this is a kind of behavior. What's wrong with it? It easily slips into vulgarity, into a kind of common life, and at the same time is calculated to lessen the respect which your neighbors have of you. If you're joking around a lot, it may be difficult for other people to take you seriously, and you can say, well, what do you care? You're a Stoic, you don't care what other people think. Well, it does matter sometimes for your ability to fulfill your role. Or, you don't want to give scandal to other people as well. He goes on and he says, refuse if you can to take an oath at all, but if that is impossible, refuse as far as circumstances allow. Why is this important? Is this, there's something wrong with taking oaths? There's something wrong with taking oaths excessively, swearing all sorts of things. The person who has to do that a lot, usually it's because there's something going on. Either they lack confidence in themselves, or other people ought to lack confidence in them. And so, we should try to avoid that sort of behavior. The next thing that he has to say is that we should avoid entertainments given by outsiders and persons ignorant of philosophy. Now, does that mean that we should avoid any sort of social life with people who don't have at least a bachelor's degree in philosophy? That is totally not what he's saying. Instead, he's saying something quite different. Those people whose lives are not informed by sort of, a seriousness that philosophy would give them. And this doesn't have to necessarily come through academic philosophy. It's possible for some fisherman who is illiterate and just happens to have integrity to be a philosophical person. But he says, avoid entertainments given by people who don't understand that. But if an appropriate occasion arises for you to attend, if it's seemly, be on the alert to avoid lapsing into the behavior of such lay people who don't understand how to behave. For you may rest assured that if a man's companion be dirty, the person who keeps close company with him must of necessity get a share of his dirt, even if he happens to be clean. So, this is a common temptation, especially for those who are making some progress, to think, well, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to be like a shining beacon, and I'll bring everybody up to my level. No, you've got to watch out that they're not going to bring you back down to their level, where they're not actually happy, but are at least trying to be happy. If you're going to be serious about Stoic philosophy, you want to keep it up all the time. He says, in things that pertain to the body, there's a certain kind of asceticism that goes with Stoicism. Take only as much as your bare need requires. Take only as much as you actually do need. And if we think about how much we really do need, it's usually not quite so much as our wants or our desires tell us we need, right? There's a lot of things we don't actually need. Watching Netflix, probably not a need. You may feel bad if you turn it off, but you'll get over it, right? Eating meat, for example. A lot of discussions about that. Most people don't need to eat that much meat. Perhaps we can get by without eating any. We certainly don't need to be eating meat at every single meal. And if somebody takes that away from you, they're not going to kill you. So, he talks about all these things. Food, drink, clothing, shelter, literally your house. And now notice what else he says. And household slaves. The Greek for that is oiketian. What does he mean by that? We don't have household slaves today. What we do have is technology. How much technology do we need? How much stuff do we need to have? We could also ask for myself, how many books do you need to have? This is a conversation that academics continually need to have with themselves. Can I get rid of some of these books? Maybe if I need them, I can go to the library. Or do I need to lug around thousands of volumes with me everywhere that I go? It's a good question. So he says, try to reduce yourself to these needs. Cut down on everything which is for outward show, which is for other people, or for luxury, which is for, feeling good, indulging yourself. That's not to say that, you can't do it every once in a while. Just realize that the more that you engage yourself in luxury, the more setbacks you're producing for yourself along the Stoic path. He talks also about sexuality and about how we ought to engage in sexual activities. He says something really interesting here at the end as well. At first he says, in your sex life, preserve purity as far as you can. The sex life is aphrodisia. So we might translate that not just as in your sexual life, but also in your romantic life, in everything that that has to do with sexual desire, right? So in your sex life, preserve purity as far as you can before marriage, and if you indulge, he says, take only those privileges which are lawful. So, don't do anything that actually goes against the laws of where you're living. Now, of course, for some people, that may be very restrictive. Some people, that may be anything goes, depending on where you're living. But there's some sort of rationality that we can stick to there. You ask yourself, is this going to be helping me on my way, or is this going to turn into a kind of entanglement? Now, notice what else he says. Do not make yourself offensive or censorious. That is, don't look down upon other people. Don't literally here, don't refute them, elenktikos. Don't start being a pain in the butt for other people who do indulge. Also, he says, don't make frequent mention of the fact that you yourself don't indulge in that. So if you don't like the fact that certain people are promiscuous because you're not promiscuous, you don't have to say anything about that, and you don't have to make a big deal of the fact that you're being faithful. Just show yourself as being faithful. That's enough. As a matter of fact, you don't even need to worry about what they're doing over there unless it directly affects you. Same thing with what other people are doing with their sexual behavior, who they're sleeping with, what sort of practices they're involved in. You don't need to be focused on that. It's enough that you maintain your integrity. That's what Epictetus is saying. We might think about that in terms of many other things as well. Now, here's another point that he brings up that's very interesting. He says, if someone brings you word that so-and-so is speaking ill of you, don't defend yourself against what has been said. Instead of trying to defend yourself or contest it or prove that they're wrong, answer something that's probably truthful. say, yes, indeed, for he did not know the rest of the faults that attach to me. If he had, these would not have been the only ones that he mentioned. Somebody says, yeah, you're a blabbermouth. You can say, yeah, well, I guess I am. But that's not the the least of my faults. And it's nice of you to only concentrate on the surface level stuff. You know, and you don't have to mention what else is going on with you. You don't have to say, yes, I also am terrible in managing my money, or I keep, making commitments to learn foreign languages and then never actually get around to learning them, or I treat my friends badly, or I give in to anger over here. You don't have to bring up all that stuff, but you can say to the other person, and this kind of disarms them, yeah, I guess if you really knew me, that would be the least of the things that you have to complain about. And like I said, it's probably truthful. I know if I were to engage in this myself, it certainly would be truthful. He also talks about going to the public shows. He says it's not necessary to go there, but if a suitable occasion ever arises, show that your principal concern is for none other than yourself, which means wish only for that to happen which does happen, and for him only to win who does win, for you will suffer no hindrance. What is he talking about there? So the public shows would be things in which contests were going on. And people would get very worked up about that. We could think about our sporting contests, with soccer, football, baseball, all these sorts of things, basketball. People will place bets. People will get very invested in this team winning or that team losing. People can get quite worked up about this, and what's going on there is they're placing their desire and their aversion in something that is totally out of their control and not even really within the control of that one particular team, because they're playing against another team. And then we factor in all the other things. The weather can change, and the chariot races, and an axle can pop off, all these other sorts of things. So Epictetus says, refrain utterly from shouting or laughter at anyone or great excitement. And then after you've left, do not talk a great deal about what took place, except insofar as it contributes to your own improvement. For such behavior indicates that the spectacle has aroused your admiration. Don't, if you're going to be a Stoic, then be a Stoic, and don't talk a lot about the spectacle that you went to. Focus on, improving your internal life. He also says, don't go rashly or readily to people's public readings, but when you go, maintain your own dignity and gravity, and at the same time be careful not to make yourself disagreeable. Now, what are public readings? We still do this with poetry. I don't know that many people go to poetry readings, but they probably should follow this advice about don't make yourself disagreeable, because there's really only one thing that a poet hates more than anything else, and that's another poet, right? And we could, that's not to say they all hate each other, but there's a lot of jealousy, a lot of enviousness within the writing community when you go around, perhaps because there's only so much attention to distribute. But what public readings were occasions where not just poets, but historians and essayists and other writers would have their scrolls, and they would read their writing in public. And it was kind of a public occasion. It was an event. It was something to go to be seen at, right? Sort of like we do all sorts of gatherings like that. We have lectures, and did you go to the lecture or not? These are, the ancient equivalent of that. So if you're going to go, behave in a seemly manner. Like it says, maintain your own dignity and don't be disagreeable. Here's another bit of useful advice. He says, when you're about to meet somebody, especially if it's somebody who you hold in high esteem, propose to yourself this question. And what he's doing there is he's setting up a model. He's saying, what would Socrates, the philosopher, very important philosopher for Stoicism, or Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, have done under these circumstances? And then this will help you figure out how to behave in those circumstances and what benefit you can get out of engaging that person. So he says, when you go to see one of those men who have great power, propose to yourself these thoughts. prepare ahead of time to be disappointed, to encounter difficulties. He says, keep in mind you might not find him at home. Whoever's there might be a gatekeeper. If you're going to go to a corporation, perhaps the secretary doesn't let you in to see the boss, right? There could be all sorts of other issues that arise. He says, perhaps the door will be slammed in your face. Perhaps you get through and this person pays no attention to you. Why? Because they've got a million different things going on themselves, and they don't have the attention to provide you, right? These are all live possibilities. It says, if despite all this, it is your duty to go, okay, go and do that, and take what comes, and don't say to yourself, it was not worth the trouble. And he says, this is characteristic of the layperson, that is, a person who is vexed at externals. Now, why was it worth the trouble? Well, if everything went the way it was supposed to, you got in, you got listened to, maybe you came to some sort of agreement, and now you got a booking, or something's going to happen, that's wonderful. If other things came up and things didn't go your way, well, you had an occasion to actually practice Stoicism. The layperson says, I had an occasion to get ticked off and waste my time, and I shouldn't have got on the subway or driven out there, and oh, this is stupid, right? But you can say, well, I had the opportunity to take my principles and to put them into practice, and now I've moved myself a little bit further along the road to fully controlling the things that are in my control and letting the things that are outside of my control go. He also says something else that's very interesting, and this is great advice even for non-Stoics. In your conversation, avoid making mention at great length and excessively of your own deeds or dangers. Why? It's not as pleasant for others to hear about your adventures as it is for you to call to mind your own dangers. Nobody likes to hear about other people more than they like to hear about themselves, except for people who are, really well put together and can listen to other people. That's not the way most people are. Odds are, for any one of us, we have some tendencies towards thinking more about ourselves than others. So this is very easy for us to relate to. If you realize that you don't like listening to other people's stories, don't impose your own stories on them. Or if you're going to do so, give them the pared down thumbnail version with the important stuff up front so they don't have to wait for it at the very end, right? He talks about the laughter thing, which we've already gone into. Then he talks about lapsing into foul language. As similar. So he says, when something like this occurs, if the occasion be suitable, now notice, he's not saying whenever this occurs, just if the occasion be suitable. What does it mean for the occasion to be suitable? The other person might actually listen to you. There's a good probability that they care about what you think and that you might be able to have some sort of useful effect. Then he says, go so far as to reprove the person. That means to criticize them and say, hey, knock it off. Don't talk like that. I don't want to hear that foul language. But he says, if the occasion doesn't arise, at all events, show by keeping silence and blushing and frowning that you're displeased by what has been said. Now, that was an ancient way. I don't know that it's so useful today. It strikes me as being a little passive-aggressive in our contemporary culture, but back at that time, that was actually a way to show some degree of respect to the other person by not coming out and saying something directly. There are cultures that are like that. But the point is, you don't have to say something to the other person all the time. And if we're going to wrap all of these sayings up in one, sort of pithy formulation at the end, it's do the things that Stoicism shows you ought to be doing, and don't worry about whether other people are doing them.